It is my pleasure to be hosting this conversation here this afternoon. I'm the founder and managing director of Eco-Business. For those of you who don't know us, we are Asia's leading news and advisory platform on sustainable development. And as Theresa has mentioned, in a world threatened by climate change, the drive towards a net zero economy is not an option. It is a moral imperative that goes to the heart of our future. And to achieve sustainable development, the bioeconomy is essential. The United Nations defines the bioeconomy as a knowledge-based production and the use of biological resources, processes, and methods that provides goods and services in a sustainable manner to all economic sectors. The term bioeconomy has become very popular in recent years, especially following its adoption by the EU and OECD as a framework for promoting the use of biotechnology to develop new products and markets. And since then, both the EU and the OECD have also implemented specific bioeconomy policies. In ASEAN, as we know, our economies are heavily reliant on the rich biological resources that exist in this region. The ASEAN bioeconomy currently employs 8% of the global labor force and generates over $2.3 trillion annually. 3/4 of this economic value lies in the agriculture, food, manufacturing, and primary resources industries. But policy dialogues on how to strengthen the regulatory frameworks around the bioeconomy have been lagging behind in this region. In applying new technologies and bio-based processes, it's possible to enhance our existing levels of productivity and to maintain the necessary balance by creating various kinds of closed-loop operations. And if deployed in a sustainable manner, the bioeconomy also has the potential to contribute to reducing the region's dependence on fossil fuels, delivering on our economic prosperity, ensuring a fair and just transition, as well as enhancing the protection of the environment and ecosystems. This is why this conversation that we're having here today is so important, and it's also an extension of the conversation that we've heard sideways. I've been up and down the whole day. And it's a really important topic because we cannot mitigate and adapt to climate change without a conversation on the bioeconomy. And so I'm really, really thrilled and delighted to have such a distinguished panel with me here so that we can deep dive into their perspectives on how we can strengthen the bioeconomy here in ASEAN. And in the spirit of ladies first, I'm going to start the panel by inviting Theresa as the ED of the ASEAN Centre for Biodiversity with the first question. The ASEAN bioeconomy is super important. How have you seen this play out, both on the ASEAN regional level, as well as across businesses and civic society?
Well, there's, based on our engagements nowadays with the businesses, there's a growing interest in bioeconomy. But we still need knowledge, capacities for increased appreciation on the true value and the dependencies on our ecosystems and on our biodiversity. As you've mentioned, our region is recognized as a high biodiversity region. We have 3 mega biodiverse countries. We have one of the countries with rich urban biodiversity, and then we also have the Mekong River countries that are also a region that's recognized as rich in biodiversity as well. But there's still some policies that we need to issue, to develop, to be able to encourage more investment for biodiversity protection by recognizing these values. But we also need research, and the academic institutions need to be engaged as well to be able to identify the real values, the true value of our nature and our biological diversity for economic purposes and taking into account our social and cultural uniqueness as well.
Thank you so much for that. While I have you here, perhaps you can give us, sort of a sneak preview on some of the policies that ASEAN is planning in terms of strengthening the bioeconomy in this region.
Okay, so last year, we were able to sign a Memorandum of Understanding with the ASEAN Business Advisory Council. Last year, it was Indonesia who chaired the ABAC, the ASEAN BAC, when this memorandum of understanding was initiated. So there's a lot of priorities already that have been identified, and there are certain incentives that are already being discussed. The financial sector as well has been on board. There was a recent discussion, a meeting of the ASEAN finance sector to be able to identify what can encourage more biodiversity-friendly or climate-friendly investments. There are some national regulations that are being put into place. But as far as the region-wide is concerned, there's also a lot of learning, exchange that can be done so that we have a more, we have somehow a standard understanding across the ASEAN member states to be able to encourage this, climate-friendly and biodiversity-friendly investment. So there are some interests. There are some national level policies, but at the regional scale, this is something that we are working on with the ASEAN Business Advisory Council at the moment through the ASEAN Business and Biodiversity Initiative.
Thank you so much, Theresa. I'm going to pick up on that finance thread later with Joris, but I want to come to Soo Khiang. I mean, RGE is a massive player in ASEAN's bioeconomy, and when we think about the bioeconomy, we think about the producers, we think about consumers, but there is an entire supply chain and ecosystem in between. So how does RGE, as a large producer of bio-based product, think about the region's bioeconomy, and how do you play a role in ensuring that it also addresses climate change mitigation and adaptation?
Well, as a big group of companies, we are conscious of our responsibility, in making sure that we develop our business in a responsible way. And that the tone is set from the founder himself, who fundamentally said, as a company, you must do good for the community, country, climate, customers, then it'll be good for the company. And that's how we have been operating. Bioeconomy is fundamentally about growing trees, which then absorbs carbon dioxide and emits oxygen, right? And we went about establishing our plantations to surround the conservation area, which are defined mostly estimated to be high conservation value forests. In that way, we have a ring of plantation which then surrounds the conservation area. And that ring of plantation serves to protect the conservation area from illegal encroachment and illegal poaching, because it protects the flora, fauna, and the biodiversities in the conservation area. What is more important is that conservation area typically needs consistent funding, which very few privately owned by conservation areas, particularly by NGOs, are able to afford a long-term consistent funding. Because of that, the company decides that, for every ton of wood I bring from a plantation, I will commit $1 to a conservation fund, which will go to fund the operational activities of restoration, conservation, even biodiversity survey and studies in the conservation area. We have even built an eco camp not only to house the staff, but also provide a research base for researchers who are interested in doing research in biodiversity of flora and fauna. So that is something that we have done. And even if in the future we are able to convert our conservation into carbon credits, our commitment is that that money will go into the conservation fund. It will not go into the company business bottom line. That is the commitment of a big player like us to conservation. We don't only do this in Indonesia. Brazil is the same, right? We have about 400,000 hectares of plantation, and we are currently own about 3/4 of 350 or 300,000 of conservation areas designated by the government. In China, we don't have plantation, but our company Sateri work closely with Conservation International, to look at water quality issues in the Poyang Lake Basin, as well as the conservation of the wetlands in that area, more particularly the biodiversity. It's a huge, rich area for migratory birds like Siberian crane, and also the indigenous species of a finless porpoise. I think my friend Sanjayan will talk about it later. But that's a kind of responsibility we take upon ourselves as a big player, including circularity, right? Because we are the world's biggest producer for viscose, which goes to produce textiles. And we know that textile recycling is a huge problem in the textile industry. And we committed some funds to NTU to ask them to help us research and design a pilot urban fit textile recycling plant. Urban fit because we want it to operate in a city like Singapore. 5 million people, therefore the electricity must be very low consumption of energy. Use of chemicals are hopefully not existent, and a small footprint, right? I mean, we hope that they can give us that pilot plant, because if that succeeds, then any big cities, if we are 20 million, can put four of them in strategic location to collect the waste straight away and recycle it, and that recycled pulp would then be shipped to where the pulp plant is to mix with virgin pulp. That is a way for us also to cater for future growth in the business. So mitigating climate change is something we always consider as part and parcel of our business. Even for the issue of fire and haze, right? I mean, some years ago in 2013, we started this fire-free village program, because one of the basic causes of the use of fire in Indonesia amongst the villagers is the clearance of land, intercrop, right? And the matches are the quickest and cheapest way for them in the village. We went about to work with some villagers in a prototype in 2013, about 3 of them, to essentially provide them a mechanical means to clear land. We appoint somebody from the village to be our chief fireman to coordinate that, and also to educate the villagers, on the hazards of using fires. And at the end of a dry season, if there are 0 fires, we will do a project, community project for them worth about $10,000 US. And it showed success. 2015 we expanded it, and the villages around in our areas of operations are very cool, no fire, in spite of the fact that it was one of the worst El Nino season in Indonesia. Since then, we have expanded the coverage of this program to almost 1 million hectares now. And it's very clear, that over that area, there has been close to at least 90% reduction of burnt areas. That has, in a way, contributed a lot to elimination of carbon emission through the use of fires, right? And of course, there's a secondary indirect impact in terms of economies in Singapore or Malaysia, in terms of haze. Plus, of course, the expenses of future health issues arising from haze. So those are the issues. And beyond mitigating change within our industry, we are also helping the other industries to decarbonize, right? And we are not using valuable resources. We are using waste palm oil, residual palm oil, and ship them out as feedstock to companies like CIPSA, to convert them into biodiesel and sustainable aviation fuel, right? And as Jessica said, we sit right in the heart of the world top 2 palm oil producers in the world. And any companies who are here, will be really salivating, if any palm oil company can work with them, because the logistic cost will be a lot less, and to produce sustainable aviation fuel in Singapore will be something very attractive to do. For every ton of sustainable aviation fuel you use in place of jet fuel, you can reduce up to 80% of carbon emission, right? And International Civil Aviation Organization estimated that for them to get to net zero by 2050, 65% of a carbon reduction will come from the use of sustainable aviation fuel. So there is a big opportunity for ASEAN to contribute to solve this global problem of carbon emission in the aviation industry. And mind you, it's not only an aviation industry, because it only started, now we are talking about the maritime industry as well, right? They can use biodiesel, you know. So clearly ASEAN has a role to play, a big role to play in decarbonizing the maritime as well as the aviation industry.
Thank you so much, Soo Khiang, for that very interesting perspective from the private sector and also the opportunities actually that are in the region for commercializing some of the bio-based economy technologies. I'll come back to you on a few things that you've mentioned, but I want to go to Sanjayan now. Conservation International has obviously done a lot of work in this region. What has been most eye-opening for you in terms of what you see, how climate change is impacting this region, and also the potential then for the bioeconomy to turn this narrative around?
Well, how much time do you have?
45 minutes.
Mr. Bey Soo Khiang actually sort of really outlined some of the big opportunities available. So, you know, I would go one step further than what he said. You know, the world is never going to tackle climate change or biodiversity loss without Asia being in the lead. Not simply participating, but actually being in the lead for doing that. And the reasons for that is the populations are here, the growth is here, and a lot of the biodiversity is here. This is also a region uniquely susceptible to climate change in terms of its impact on nature. So if you look at, you know, from coral bleaching to large-scale forest fires, all the way from Australia to Indonesia, to glaciers. You know, Asia's rivers are fed by glaciers, so water and water loss, to how tuna fish migrate in the Pacific. You know, 14 countries in the Pacific are incredibly dependent on tuna for their resources. I mean, they don't have anything else. That is their primary source for their GDP. And those fish are changing their behavior because of climate change. So the winners are now losers. Some losers have become new winners. So you could go down the list on every animal and plant, and you'll find the impact and it's visible here. But I think the biggest impact is, of course, going to be on people. So we live in a very unique region when it comes to climate change. And one of the big challenges is that much of Asia is going to be unlivable, unworkable, certainly, without enormous amounts of fossil fuels being used to keep us cool. And that will only work for a very, very small segment of society. Because as temperatures rise and humidity rises, you're going to get to the place where you cannot function. You know, the human body can deal with cold very, very well. We're very capable of, all you need is food and some kind of fuel, and you can stay warm in very cold temperatures. But the human body does not have good capabilities of dealing with heat. There's a maximum limit to which we can cool ourselves. Like, there's just a physical limit. So there's no way that humans can function in that system. And given the population pressures in this region, more people will suffer from heat-induced stress and death than anything else. So climate change is going to have these huge impacts. And I think most people in this audience, everyone here, certainly understands this. Let's look at the other side of this coin, though. You know, what the positive side of this is that the world has woken up very dramatically and very quickly to the importance of nature and the importance of including nature in thinking both about climate but also human well-being. So we cannot reach the 1.5 degrees Celsius targets that were established in Paris, or even the 2 degrees target, or even the 2.5 degree target. We cannot reach any of those targets without the inclusion of nature. So the only way to keep the 1.5 degree window open today is through the inclusion of nature. So 30% of the emissions that we see today comes from the destruction and conversion of nature. And when you think about that, the opportunity to reverse it provides lots and lots of opportunities for jobs, particularly in the rural South, right? In rural communities where jobs are incredibly important, the ability to reverse that trend and go into a restoration economy or a bioeconomy is actually quite high. So I see Asia playing a lead role in that. The second thing I would say is that, you know, there's a lot of opportunity today for businesses to make, make some level of profit from that investment in the bioeconomy. At least it can be net neutral. At least it can be sort of money neutral. And then there are opportunities for actually being positive about it. So one project that we work on together, for example, Mr. Bey was talking about Poyang Lake. So this is the largest freshwater lake in China. It has the entire migratory population of Siberian cranes. So it's very important for birds. It's important for wildlife. But it's also important for 40 million people who depend on that lake in the basin for fresh water, both for industrial purposes, but also for drinking water, right? Now, the company, so Sateri, for example, their business model is predicated on having access to clean water. And maybe 10, 15 years ago, that would be a global commons. Today, it isn't. So there is an obligation in the company, if the company wants to continue to operate long into the future, to work with government, but also work with communities, work with the nonprofit sector to figure out ways to clean that water up. And that's where we come in to help provide wetland creation and clean water creation within the lake basin. If you take that one step further, you can find a way now to monetize it, because what they're doing now is providing a global good, certainly a regional good, right? They're benefiting from it, but many, many, many others are benefiting from it either. So one more step and you end up with things like water credits, which you can start seeing how that companies that are going to lean in further for their own benefit, but also for the benefit of others, could become really a commodity that actually has some level of monetary value. The very simple principle, and you're going to go to a banker next, so he can talk much more eloquently about this, but there are very few things that are true in the financial investment world, right? If I asked you, what do you want to invest in for 5 years or 10 years, you can come up with many good companies and many good ideas. But if I said, what about 30 years from now? What business would you invest in today that's going to be around for 30 years? What about 50 years? I bet you very, very few businesses are going to exist in that time frame, right? But the one thing I know for sure, 100%, nature in the future will be more valuable than it is today. 100%. 100%. And if you know that to be true, there must be an investment model for it. We don't know what the curve looks like, right? We don't know what that curve looks like. But it's definitely got an upward trend.
Thank you so much, Sanjayan. Super fascinating, and you've obviously segued into the finance sector really well here. Joris, BNP Paribas has, in recent years implemented financing and investment policies that have significant impact on climate change and biodiversity. The bank actually set a target, a 3 billion euros target, in financing linked to terrestrial biodiversity protection. Can you give us a snapshot of how the financial institutions are thinking about investing in nature?
Sure, thank you. Unfortunately, investing in a 50-year horizon requires pricing natural capital, which today is not necessarily reflected in the market, and that's, I think, one of the issues that need to be resolved. But when I kind of take a step back and see what the financial sector, what banks have already done to kind of contribute to this positive evolution, I think it started with kind of the origins of ESG, of corporate responsibility of financial institutions, where the first kind of steps that were taken in the initial phase is avoiding a negative. So when we look at allocating capital, at channeling funding, and even client relationships, I think we've already come a long way in no longer working with clients, with corporates, with institutions that do not apply kind of rules, global standards of at least conservation, at least non-pollution. And so at BNP Paribas, for example, we have 7 sector policies that define in certain of these sensitive sectors under which conditions we are willing to work with a company such as RGE, for example. And then very specifically, looking at the picture here, one policy is pulp and paper, and the other one is the palm oil policy, which define under which conditions we will work with a company that's active in those sectors. We have, for example, also have a mining policy that does the same thing for the mining industry
that we support, for example, in Indonesia or in Australia. So that's very much avoiding a negative. For example, we would not work with companies today that are involved in deforestation, that do not respect community rights, etc. If we then look at the more positive, results or goals that we want to pursue by allocating capital, we do a very careful analysis of the clients that we work with. For financial institutions, but more importantly, I think for corporate clients. So very interestingly, so at BNP Paribas now, we have what we call an ESG assessment. So we do a full, very detailed assessment of all the ESG risks that our clients are exposed to, how they mitigate, how they manage those risks, or how they turn them into opportunities. And actually, so for in our credit process, the ESG assessment now comes ahead of the actual credit analysis, the financial analysis of a company, because we want to incorporate in the reasoning, in the analysis, all these ESG aspects. What we are hoping for in the future is that we'll be able to incorporate also, for example, the pricing of natural capital when there is a positive impact on natural capital, that we will be able to quantify that. Today, we cannot do that, but we are working, we're really putting in place the foundations for that. Already in terms of, so it's not yet applicable for biodiversity, but in terms of climate change and carbon impact, we have a team of data scientists that do a carbon analysis and that ensure carbon alignment. So we've set very clear targets on how we want to decarbonize our lending and our investment portfolios. And we have data scientists looking at, of course, the total picture, the total portfolio, but also each individual client. And we will assess, when we finance a project, we will assess the impact that will have on the carbon intensity of the product that's delivered. And that will be a very important element in the decision of whether or not to proceed with that project. And then going even further, when we look at investment strategies, either where we advise our clients or where we invest on their behalf in our asset management business, there again, the ESG assessment and the orientation, the outlook of, for example, on a share price, to what extent it can be impacted by a negative or positive impact on biodiversity, is fully incorporated in the investment advice or the investment decision. And then going beyond that, which is not yet a fully, I would say, bankable product, but where we are involved is in financing certain elements of financing of the projects that were discussed here, to the extent that those projects can allow to generate additional revenues, be it from fishing or certain natural services will generate additional revenues. That can be the basis for a classic loan financing or a bond issuance. When it goes beyond that, so when we're looking at impact on nature, on biodiversity, that's not yet priced by the market, we then work together with multilateral development institutions, with regional, local development banks, or we bring in philanthropic capital to kind of bridge that funding need to the extent that it cannot be taken by the financing market. So that's the broad scope of contributions that I think the financial sector can make.
Thank you very much, Joris. Super fascinating to see how the financial institutions are playing a role. I'm really curious, though, you mentioned about carbon analysis. What is the equivalent, I suppose, for CO2 when we talk about nature and biodiversity? Because I think there's a lot of conversations happening around the Task Force for Nature-Related Disclosures, TNFD, where you're trying to put nature on the balance sheets of companies. But it's quite hard because there is no quantifiable metric the way that we have on carbon. How are you thinking about that?
So the answer is in the question. So there is not yet any accepted quantification of So for carbon, it exists. Unfortunately, not. We had the Kyoto Protocol, which then fell away. Today, there are different types of carbon markets in the world. So the most advanced is the EU, the ETS, which is a cap and trade system, which allows companies to emit, depending on the sector, emit a certain quantity of carbon per production. And if they go under that, they get issued carbon credits, which they can sell on the market. Those companies that emit too much carbon have to buy those. And that's how the carbon emission of the steel industry, the cement industry, power production is priced, and that's then priced by the market. Side note, it can also be a negative because, for example, in power production in Europe right now, because the winter has been very, very mild, so there's been less power generation, so there's actually less demand for additional carbon credits, which has kind of pushed the price down a little bit. So it works both ways. But that's a market mechanism that's been put in place in the EU. It exists, for example, in California. It exists in China for certain industry, mostly related to power generation. But there's not yet a global standard for that. So which is why we then work with voluntary emission reduction certificates, so VERs, which again price carbon. And that's where we're beginning to see kind of a pricing of certain biodiversity, certain nature-related investments. When there is avoidance of carbon emissions, when there is carbon sequestration, for example, through investment in mangrove forests, there is a nascent movement to start pricing that in these voluntary, in these VERs, these voluntary credits. But it's still very early days, and there are still a lot of issues with pricing these credits, also with longevity, because the standards have not yet been set. Or there's still a lot of evolution to go through there.
Thank you very much. I think we're just at the frontier or the tip of how we see these credits develop, especially where biodiversity is concerned. Sanjayan, are there any thoughts here before I go to yours?
Yeah, sure. I'll just add a bit to these fantastic comments. So, in Europe and North America, it's now easy, I would say, for the conservation community, the NGO community, to meet with the leadership of virtually every company at the CEO level or the board level. And that really is coming from either regulatory pressure, fears of that, or from consumer fears. It's changing in Asia, and I have no doubt it'll catch up in Asia, but that's still, there's still a few steps to go on that count. RGE is always there at these forums, so it's an exception, not the rule, I would say. It's an exception, not the rule. However, that sort of misses the point a little bit. Look, the whole predication of conservation in some ways, or conservation is working with business, is predicated on this idea of balance. We're going to balance nature's needs with human needs. But that doesn't work. It really won't work. It doesn't work. Like, anytime there's a balance between human needs and nature's needs, who do you think wins? I mean, like, without a doubt, it's the human needs they're going to win. I mean, it's not even close. It's like 99% versus like 1%. And we'll fight about the 1%. And even in the 1%, then we'll say, oh, now we need to balance within the 1%. So, that notion is not the right way to approach this. I'm from Sri Lanka originally. I was born in Sri Lanka, but I went to college in the United States. And when I was in school in the Western United States, one of the things that puzzled me was why communities were logging the forests around them. And you were thinking, U.S. is such a rich country. It's not an agricultural country. It's not an agroeconomy. Why are there so many fights in communities about logging? Why are there protests? Why am I protesting the logging of these forests around these small communities scattered throughout Oregon and Washington State and California? And it was virtually impossible to stop. Virtually impossible to stop. And the reason for that is because in Oregon, they had linked the amount of money going into education into the schools, into the local schools with logging revenue. So very smart by the logging companies. You know, they linked this, they linked it, right? So they basically said the more I log, the more revenue comes to the school. So every parent, whether you're a conservationist or you're a logger, every parent made a simple calculation. I will deal with this for another 3-4 years. Once my kid is out of school, then I will stop the logging. But then the next generation came in, and the next generation, next generation. We need to apply that same idea to conservation. We need to link production with protection. Then it becomes in the inherent self-interest of the business enterprise to do that. I mean, I'm just going to pick on you because you're here, because, you know, like the work you're doing in Ponyang Lake, of course, is a global good. So, of course, it's beneficiary. And you might take pride in it, and Anderson takes pride in it to talk about it. But at the end of the day, it's critical for the business. If the water quality and water quantity disappears, the business stops. Now take that one step further and find a way to link production with protection. So that is the kind of work that Conservation International is really trying to do in, say, Indonesia with the fisheries. It's not protect over here and produce over here. If you link the two, now the more revenue you're generating from fisheries, the more money flows into the protection of marine protected areas. The more marine protected areas you have, the more you can also then take fish out of the ocean. And if we can find that model, and it might not be a perfect model, you might have to incentivize it, you might have to give tax breaks, you might have to put policies in place to level the playing field, you might have to bring in philanthropy. But now you have, to your point, a self-generating model where production is linked with protection, and it's not about balance, it's about link.
Thank you so much for that. I think that's super important to understand that production and protection goes together. Joris, coming to you, I mean, at the heart of it is all money, right? I mean, we've talked a lot about how the investments are flowing, and it's actually come up in the questions as well. We have 2 questions here for you, I think. How do we know when investments are good for biodiversity, was the first question. And then the second is, how do we ensure that nature financing reflects the true value of nature while being priced competitively enough to create demand?
Okay, those are such easy questions.
Sorry.
Actually, I just want to quickly pick on
Sure.
what you were saying, because I think where ASEAN is kind of could potentially play a really leading role because of the needs that, well, because of the natural capital that's available or that's present in ASEAN, but combined with needs, for example, of smallholder farmers. So there's still a lot of needs in the community. Whereas the EU really is kind of leading by regulation and imposing that through the carbon border adjustment mechanism. It's trying to export that regulation. The US is leading through subsidy under the Inflation Reduction Act and other measures that they've put in place. I think in ASEAN really that the link that you mentioned between conservation but also revenue generation and really bridging those two, and in that way making projects bankable, financeable, and open for investment. I think that's where ASEAN then also, if we look at what's being done, where Singapore is in the Singapore taxonomy is actually further advanced than the EU taxonomy, which is then hopefully will be reflected in ASEAN taxonomy. So that then creates the beginning of a regulatory environment that allows for that. I think is you know, really pushing things forward. Can you then repeat the question, because now I've forgotten?
No worries at all.
I was so.
It's about,
so,
yeah.
But how do we price that?
How do we know that investment is good for biodiversity?
Okay.
And then how do you price that?
Yeah. So the pricing, it kind of goes back to what we were saying earlier in terms of the pure pricing of natural capital, of ecosystem services. Today it's very difficult or not possible. So they're not always priced by the market. An example we could see is that, for example, in palm oil or, you know, where more and more, I think it's a requirement, for example, the global MNCs, the Unilever, Procter & Gamble, in addition to the grievances trackers that they have and the NGO activity that of course they take into account. Also more and more they need to, it's required by their end customers to work or to offer a product that's labeled sustainable. And so then we come into labeling, we come into traceability, and that kind of creates a pricing differential on their product. But to really price natural capital, ecosystem services, today I don't think we have a mechanism for that. So then it needs to be priced by government, by regulation, to the extent that that's being done today. So as I said before, there is a long way to go there, because we basically need to, if we go back to a very fundamental theory, these are all externalities that in the neoclassic pricing model that today we apply, they're not valued. And so we need to internalize these externalities through, and that will have to be done through regulation, ultimately.
Can I just add something?
Go ahead.
So you're correct in that for biodiversity, we don't have global pricing, for sure. And we're not close to that. But it's not because you can't price it, but it's because it's not fungible. So the price in one place is different from the price in another place. Your tiger in Sumatra is different priced to the tiger in India, which is different price to the tiger in Texas. Texas has a lot of tigers, it turns out. So depends where the tiger is, changes the price. That's not the same with carbon, right? So a ton of carbon is a ton of carbon regardless of where that carbon is. That's what's created this sort of challenge when it comes to biodiversity. It's not insurmountable. So in any one place you can absolutely price it, but you can't, we don't have a good mechanism or an agreed upon mechanism for biodiversity in one place to be replaced by biodiversity in another place.
Very good point. Go ahead.
I just want to add the point, right? A lot of us, like me, also at the very beginning expect answers before we do anything. And not only answers, but very accurate answers, you know. But in the nature of sustainability, there is a cost for not doing, and there's a cost for doing, right? And regardless of the answer, so long as you are generally correct, that's why they always call me general, right? If you're in a general directionally correct, let's do it, how do we end up with $1 per ton for every ton of wood I bring to the mill? I got no formula to arrive at it. It's okay, $1. Let's start with $1 first. If it's enough to fund the operational activities, then okay, it's about right. If it's not enough, well, we have to increase it further, right? I mean, that's how we from the private sector does it, so to speak. We don't wait for 100% accuracy. So long as we think 80% good enough, let's go and get it done. And that's how we also operate with NGOs as well, I mean, in terms of convincing them that the general direction is more important than the actual answer itself.
Very much agree with that. In fact, it brings to mind a quote, "Let not perfection be the enemy of the good." But Joris, did you want to add something?
No, just on the next question is how does one know whether an investment is good for biodiversity? I think there's a lot of guidance that's available in the market. So in terms of investment funds, mutual funds, again, it's led by the EU, but there's very clear regulation in place, Article 8, Article 9. So the labeling there it's very stratified through regulation, and that will hopefully evolve in kind of a global standard. The rating agencies now all provide ESG ratings for companies. Again, we can criticize and, again, it can always be better, but it does give a lot of guidance. And a lot of financial institutions, BNP Paribas, but a lot of our peers as well, provide guidance. For example, in all the equity analysis, investment advice that we provide, there is a section on ESG which addresses a number of these issues, including biodiversity. So it's a lot of that information today is readily available.
Thank you very much for that. Just with an eye on the time, I know we have to wrap up. I'm going to just, maybe ask this last question, which I think is a great question from Anita to Theresa, and then I will ask each of you to just wrap up very quickly with the final question, which is, if there's one thing you could change, like you had a magic wand, and you think this one thing would help drastically, significantly move the needle for ASEAN's bioeconomy, what would it be? But Theresa, I'm going to ask you this question, which is from Anita. How can we ensure that emerging and developing country voices are engaged in the setting of guidelines for nature investments?
Well, we can start with ourselves in the region. We need to, if we talk about ASEAN centrality in the region, and we need to see how we can be able to come up with the standard policy. We need to cooperate. We need to strengthen coordination, exchange experiences within the region, see what policies can work across all the 10 member states, and that can be the contribution that we can make at the global level. But first, we need to be able to come up with these policies that we require to be able to promote more investments for biodiversity protection. In the case of for example, our work with the ASEAN Business Advisory Council, they started with targets on net zero, on just transition. Our role is to mainstream biodiversity into that existing legacy programs already, so that we can hit two targets, multiple targets with one action. Working within ASEAN heritage parks, reforesting degraded areas, taking into account the native species that we have, already just contributes to mitigation, to climate action. At the same time, we will be able to contribute to addressing biodiversity loss as well. So I think that's the kind of, and then we can maximize available resources. Because if we think about hitting several, environmental targets, addressing the triple planetary crisis by doing just one action, then it can actually, maximize the limited resources that we have in the region. And then if we share best practices, because we are all similarly situated, I think that can be, and then highlighting that in the global arena is already some contribution that we can be able to, this is something that we can contribute to what is going on at the global level. We don't have to wait for global valuation, global standard valuation, yes. As Mr. Bey mentioned. And I already mentioned that at the local level, the ASEAN Heritage Parks already are doing some type of valuation that allows them to sustainably finance their protection within the local area, that benefits both the communities and the businesses that work in those communities.
Thank you so much, Theresa. Just do it, basically, your motto. Mr. Bey.
Well, my request may end up work for Ms. Theresa, right? Because my only wish is that if ASEAN government can get together and tackle the illegal wildlife trade across country. Because, based on experience in RER, the Riau's ecosystem restoration, even songbirds are being caught, poached, and it travel across countries, right? And so the only way, one of the ways to eliminate poaching is really to tackle this illegal wildlife trade. And if ASEAN government can get together and work that scheme, I think it'd be a dreamland here. Then we have many years of biodiversity safety, so to speak. Yeah.
Thank you for that, Sanjayan.
I think having the Asian governments can come up with a useful price for the carbon markets, and then make a part of that market open to private sector. So that's the key thing, not just hold it all for themselves, because you're never going to move fast enough if you just hold all of it for government, but allow some chunk of it, 30%, something like that, to be available on the private market. I think that will move I think that'll generally move conservation in Asia very, very quickly, and it will also, provides lots of rural jobs, provide nature protection. I like your idea, by the way, of the wildlife trade. I actually think that's very, very possible. to do that. And same thing with mine. I don't think it's a magic wand sort of thing. I think it is actually very possible. But you need countries you need one or two to lead, the ones that have a lot of carbon right now, to lead a little bit, and then use their preeminence to convince the others to come along to create a marketplace.
Much stronger political leadership is much needed in this region. Joris, final words.
Yes, and we didn't coordinate this, but I would, complementary to this, I think really there's room. So of course we need regulation, we need public policy, we need mobilization of civil society. But I think ASEAN governments could contribute a lot through that to taking a little bit more of a leadership role also on the financial side by issuing green bonds or instruments for financing of those investments. Because ultimately, as long as there's no market pricing for it, a lot of this needs to be carried by the government, but there are a lot of instruments available that can contribute to mobilization of civil society, which ultimately is the driver that's required to push all this, to push this agenda forward.
Thank you so much, Joris. And as moderator, I think my final word would be education and engagement. And that links back to how we've spent the last hour and a half today on this very important topic. And I would love to encourage all of you to keep engaging on this topic because it's ever so important for our region. And please join me to thank the panelists for a really, really fascinating and insightful discussion.